Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Kursk direction, because according to information we have, the Russians launched their third counter-offensive operation, and according to the Ukrainians, the Russians are planning to defeat the Ukrainians completely and to force them to fall back, so simply saying to liberate the Sudzha area. So let's discuss in details because information is very interesting. First, let's discuss the article that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources. Before we start, one important thing. The Russians began their offensive yesterday on the 7th of November, and it's already like 36 or 24 hours left since the beginning of this operation, but we still haven't received even a single video that can confirm Russian attack or the successful actions, defense actions of the Ukrainians, or successful offensive actions. We don't know for sure what exactly is happening right now on the territory of this region, but we have some articles that were published by the soldiers on the ground and those who has connections with the soldiers on the ground. First, let's talk about the deep state report. They are saying that the Russian army forces have launched a new wave of offensive operations in Kursk. The day turned out to be difficult for the units of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russian army forces have resumed offensive operations in Pogrebki, Zelený Shlях, Darina and Sudzha. The situation is being clarified along the last vector, and in the remaining areas the main onslaught has been started. Of course, the Russians will not stop there and will try to carry out massive assaults with the newly arrived units more than once. So that was stated by Deep State, and summarizing their report, we can make a conclusion based on them. They're trying to tell us that the first wave of attack, or the first, let's say, day of Russian counteroffensive wasn't so successful for the Russians. It was more successful for the Ukrainians. This at least was Deep State was trying to tell us. Let's talk about another post that was published also by pro-Ukrainian sources, and he's saying the following: Russian counteroffensive in Kursk area has started. As I said before, the author, they expected to liberate their territory for 2 or 3 months. Let's see whether it's a realistic desire. Armed forces of Ukraine expected that the Russians will launch an offensive 2 days ago at the 5th of November. A couple of days ago they had rotation in Lyubimovka, and 51st Regiment changed 137th Regiment there. So the Russians finished rotation process and brought the fresh forces. Furthermore, this author stated that a couple of days ago 810th Marine Brigade received 40 new BTR 182A. And also he is saying that the Russians brought additional 5,500 stormtroopers at the left flank. So the Russians were prepared by the beginning of the 7th of November. Also, this author is saying that the Russians, yes, they launched 3 attacks, and according to this author, those 3 attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians suffered the significant losses. For example, we can see this according to the next post that the 810th Marine Brigade used today at least 14 BTR 82A. From those 40 new that they received, 10 of them are destroyed or damaged and abandoned. So as you can see, the Russians, according to this Ukrainian author, lost around 70-80% of assets that they were using during those attacks. So this is the second pro-Ukrainian post that tell us that the situation was very difficult for the Russians. But when talking about pro-Russian resources, we have completely different posts, completely different articles. For example, this is the article that was published by some pro-Russian probably resource that has connections with the soldiers on the ground. Russian units have already entered Darina. They are successfully crushing Novooleksiivka. The Ukrainian armed forces are in complete dismorale. They brought in prisoners there, put them in the strongholds without cover drones, normal ammunition, food, water, etc. No one is evacuating the wounded, and many other things. So as you can see, as for the Russians, they're saying completely different story. According to the Russians, they managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt. They're crushing right now the Ukrainians in Novooleksiivka, and the Russians entered several villages. Now let's return back on map, and let's see and let's try to understand what exactly all of them were talking talking about. First of all, according to pro-Ukrainians, the Russians launched their offensive in the direction of Pogribki, most likely using this route of attack. Also, according to information we have, the Russians are attacking, or as the Russian author stated, the Russians are crushing the Ukrainians in Novooleksiivka. Furthermore, according to information we have, there are very heavy clashes in the area of Zelený Shlях, and according to pro-Russian sources, they managed to answer the village of Darina. So this is the situation on the northern and on the western flank of the Sudzha direction. Furthermore, according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians also attacking the Ukrainians in the direction of Sudzha. As for this, I believe that the Russians are attacking on the line between Большая Солдатska and Martinovka, trying to attack the Ukrainian positions with the shortest way. As for this area, we have several videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians, most likely before the beginning of offensive operation. In this video, we can see the use of FAB 3000. Anyway, most likely today, on the 8th of November, we're gonna start receiving first videos, both of from pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian side, and maybe today we're gonna understand whether the first day of Russian offensive was successful or not. Anyway, the sources are saying that right before the beginning of Russian counteroffensive, Russian third counteroffensive, the Ukrainians brought the significant number of forces in the Sudzha direction with the purpose to slow down the Russians. And I'll remind you, this is very important, that since the beginning of November, we received the significant number of videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions on the territory of Ukraine right in front of the Sudzha direction. So the Russians, since the beginning of November, were trying to destroy as many as possible operational reserves. You remember this video, and in this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover the concentration of Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of the village by the name of Kayanitsa, and after the Russians discovered the concentration of Ukrainians, the Russians began bombing this territory with a significant number of Iskander missiles, and the Ukrainians suffered the significant losses. Furthermore, we have lots of videos of counter-artillery dose, and during the previous months, the Russians were bombing and attacking Sumy as much as possible with the drones, with Geraint drones, with everything they have. So the Russians probably did very good homework, but at least we will understand this, whether the homework was made good or not during the next several days during the Russian counterattacks. I'll remind you that the first two Russian counterattacks were pretty successful. As a result of the first Russian counterattacks that took place in September and November, the Russians managed to restore control over huge territories. We're talking about this region. Now the Russians are planning to move further and most likely to cut, let's say, half of this territory, or maybe even to collapse, to defeat the Ukrainians completely. So let's wait, and sooner or later we're going to receive additional updates. And now let's move further, and let's move right to the Pokrovsk direction, because the main updates are coming from this territory. First, let's talk about some changes on the ground in the vicinity of Novooleksiivka. According to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, managed to improve their positions along this tree line. As you can see, the changes just about this small part of the tree lines that the Russians managed to secure and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Now we see that the Russians created a broad front line from the village of Novooleksiivka towards the village of Arkhangelskaya. Maybe the Russians will try to attack further in the north. As for the Selidova direction, during the previous 24 hours, we have several changes, and the most important is that according to both pro-Ukrainian mappers and neutral mappers, the Russians managed to take under control the village of Novooleksiivka completely. These are the changes on the ground in comparison between the 7th of November and the beginning of the 8th of November. The Russians are moving further. Also, we have reports that the Russians managed to secure the village of Novodmitrievka completely. That was stated by neutral mappers. So this is the progress of the Russians during the previous nights of the local time. Also, we have additional report about the Russians' improvements around the village of Ilinka. This is the map by the end of the 7th of November. This is the map by the beginning of the 8th of November. And this map was provided us, and this information was provided us by neutral mappers. I'll remind you that this area, this region has a very big dynamic, fast dynamic. Just yesterday we got some And the day before yesterday, we just received the information that the Russians captured the village of Stepanovka. Yesterday, we got the information that the Russians entered the village of Ilinka, and there were very heavy clashes in the most northeastern part of the settlement. The Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians within a very close distance. And today, we see that the Russians tightened the noose around the settlement. Most likely tomorrow or the day after, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this territory towards the village of Berestki. Furthermore, we continue receiving updates about first sabotage and reconnaissance group that managed to enter the village of Sontsovka. Something tells me that this direction might collapse very fast and very soon. Also, we continue receiving lots of updates from the area of responsibilities of the group of forces south. The Russians continue offensive in the direction of Yelizavetovka, and very reliable pro-Russian resources stated that the southeastern part of the village is already under complete Russian control. There are very heavy clashes and fighting are ongoing. Furthermore, we got the video published by the Russian sources of how the Russian units and Russian stormtroopers were moving and heading towards the settlement. We haven't received anything from the territory of settlement itself, but we have a lot of videos of how the Russians were heading towards Ukrainian positions in the southeastern part of the village of Yelizavetovka. Furthermore, we have some changes on the ground between this dense network of the fortifications and the village itself. So these are the changes according to information we have. Now let's move further, and today we are also going to talk about the situation that is currently taking place in the Orekhov direction, because the Russians also show a very big dynamic in this area, and during the previous week we have significant changes on the ground in Russian favor. The Ukrainian sources are saying that the Russian armed forces are ready to launch a powerful offensive in the Zaporozhye region. Ukrainian sources reported citing intelligence data. As for the changes on the ground, for example, today we have adjusted once again the map in Russian favor, and today we adjusted the map based on this video. In this video we can see Ukrainian sabotage, Ukrainian reconnaissance drone that was flying above these tree lines and coordinating Ukrainian artillery. When the Ukrainian artillerymen received the coordinates, they began bombing these positions. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map based on the edge positions of the armed forces of Russian Federation. The Russian progress in this area was confirmed both by geolocation and by neutral mappers. This is the map that was shown us by neutral mappers, reliable mappers. Now let's discuss the dynamic. For example, this is the situation on the 4th of November. The Russians were very far from the village of Novoandreevka, Novodmitrievka. The Russians were controlling just the village of Kopony and northern strongholds and Nistyryanka, and starting of the 5th of November, the Russians began moving slowly, step by step, but in the direction of Orekhov agglomeration. And this is the situation on the ground by the beginning of the 8th of November. Most likely the Russians are planning to move further. Furthermore, we have very important updates about the situation from Kiev itself. For example, the Ukrainians are saying that the general staff is saying that recently the Russians has increased the number of regiments, brigades and divisions and the number of its personnel by almost 100,000 people. The length of the front line has also increased. In order to strengthen the front line, new brigades need to be created within the Ukrainian armed forces. So we start receiving a lot of updates that the Russians managed to increase their army unexpectedly for the Ukrainians. Now let's talk also about very important details that are coming from Putin. Yesterday Putin was interviewed and he gave us a lot of very interesting statements and a lot of very interesting information. For example, Putin reported that Ukrainian armed forces are suffering huge losses in the Kursk region. Up to 15,000 troops are blocked near Kupiansk. So that was stated by Putin. More losses in 3 months of hostilities than the Kiev regime had in the whole last year. More than 30,000 troops. They lost fewer tanks, about 200, and last year lost 240 in my opinion. There are simply fewer tanks. That's why the losses are lower, they are used less. So Putin also stated that the Russian armed forces blocked a total of 15,000 Ukrainian troopers in the Kupiansk direction. So most likely Putin is talking about this north in Kupiansk direction between the villages of Yankovka and Kolesnikovka. The Ukrainians lost possibilities to evacuate their personnel channel, and the Russians, as we know, are pushing the Ukrainians in the direction of Oskol. Furthermore, he reported that if Ukraine does not remain neutral, it is difficult to imagine good neighboring relations. This means that Ukraine will be constantly used in the interest of the states and to the detriment of the interest of the Russian Federation. We are determined to create conditions for long-term settlements so that Ukraine becomes an independent sovereign state and not an instrument in the hands of the third countries. So most likely these are something like an answers to the Donald Trump. You know that since the Donald Trump was elected, most of the leaders have already congratulated him, including the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And Putin is most likely the only leader that still hasn't congratulated Donald Trump, and I'm not sure that he is going to do this. I'm talking about congratulating via phone call. We got very interesting information that Putin is waiting a call from Donald Trump first, but we think that Donald Trump is not going to call Putin as well, and this simple thing, this small detail can lead to complete absence of any negotiations between these two leaders, and of course this will lead to continue of war on the territory of Ukraine. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.